The Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast is back for another episode. Join Marc S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast. My name is Marc Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting this podcast. And thanks to everyone for listening in. We will have two breaks as we normally do, one to hear about the Healthcare Labyrinth website and all of the resources there, and then a second ad that talks about my book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Today we have a special guest and also sort of a radio audience here. My daughter, Kathleen Ryan, I call her Kitty, is my special guest today. And we'll also unveil another name we use for her now that she has had surgery. She just went through brain surgery, and we're going to talk all about that. I did a 4-series blog in tandem with my daughter about her brain surgery entitled My Courageous Daughter is Having Brain Surgery. So Kathleen, welcome. And I know your recovery is going real well, and we're all very excited about that. So Kathleen, the first thing I wanted to sort of get into is, you agreed to do sort of this blog series and this podcast with me because we were both very concerned about the fact that there are so many people in America that are uninsured and underinsured. And many people that know me from my podcasts as well as my blog know a lot about how I think about that. And I'm a pretty atypical Republican. But I wanted to turn it over to you really quickly to sort of give us your feel as somebody in a younger generation about the status of healthcare in America and some of your concerns about it.
Yeah. Okay. It's grim. I mean, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have had access to my medications or most of the things I needed, and I would have just probably been disabled. So, I mean, that would be the reality for, I would argue, the average person.
Yeah, I think it's a great point because if you don't have the means and a family, and we're very privileged to be who we are and have relative wealth,
and your knowledge.
And knowledge of the system, I agree, is often very important in access. But you raise a good point. The very best people in the world and the most intelligent people, if they have sort of comorbidities or disease states, sort of end up not being productive. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your diagnosis and actually your migraines too, which are probably related but also independent. But one of the reasons you had brain surgery is because of a brain malformation that you got diagnosed with many, many years ago. Can you walk us through that so our listeners understand it?
Yeah. So when I was 17, I was diagnosed with a cavernous malformation, which I probably was born with. We found out about it because it ruptured. So I had a bleed. I had some speech issues for like about a week. And then I woke up one morning to my face twitching on one side. So eventually, like the next day, we found out what the issue was. And they did kind of a watch and wait with me where I was just on anti-seizure medicines for the last like 12 years to prevent seizures. But I've had issues and kind of symptoms within that time frame.
Yeah. And that was one of my scariest days of my life because I remember you knocking on the door. You had called 911 because you thought I had already gone to work. And I opened the door and I see my daughter literally with half of her face paralyzed. And I had no idea what was going on. And my wife had already gone to an appointment she had. And it was scary because you always think of your kids as healthy and never going to have issues. And you sort of were largely, except for this event. And then they diagnosed you with the malformation. And again, when I think about it, there's always hindsight, right? But if we had known how well the brain surgery went, we might have done it 10 years ago. At the same time, technology was not as good.
Yeah,
but
we've had 12 years of changing in that.
Yeah, but I sort of have some regrets about that, right? But at the time, I think the physicians were sort of 50-50 on doing it, right?
Well, and when I was still in high school, I wasn't having the same kind of issues I was. Like, I feel pretty confident in saying that if I was having the issues I've had in the last 3 or so years, the doctor that I had at the children's hospital, if I were still seeing him, would have decided to do surgery, but I wasn't having those at the time.
Yeah.
So I think it's also just as time went on, things changed.
Yeah, makes sense. And again, to have this diagnosed literally when you are ready to go and audition for Teen Jeopardy, if I remember correctly,
yes.
as well as ready to go to college, was sort of a bit nerve-wracking for you. And I remember spending the night in the hospital with you and your mother thinking maybe you were going to have surgery way back then because they didn't quite know what it was.
Yeah. Well, and that night we just knew they said I had a mass on my brain. They didn't know what it was.
Yeah, exactly right. So, just give us a little more clarity on why your decision to have the surgery and talk a little more about the symptoms. I want to tell my listeners that I say to my wife and my daughter that I felt a little set up about this surgery because they were sort of planning it for about 8 months.
You didn't want to talk about it.
I know. I didn't want to talk about it. I agree. But I find out in early January that you want to do this and you drag me to the neurosurgeon. But it was very nerve-wracking for me. You guys had gotten used to it. And I finally got to the point where I understood why and why you wanted to do that. But tell us why, right? You could have continued on without doing it and had medications and things like that, but just give us the why.
Well, the biggest one is it's hard to say what they are, if they're like small seizures or what, just because no one else is there when they happen, or they're really minor for me and they're not what traditionally people think of when they think of seizures. But I've been having a lot of issues with that. So when I was still in my undergrad in the last couple years, I had a lot of issues with my hands would twitch. My face would really very, very subtly twitch. And then more recently, in the past couple years, I've had issues more with speech where my mouth will just kind of go almost numb and I'll have trouble if I'm speaking, like wrapping my tongue around certain words. And the malformation was near my speech zone, so that would check out. And then I've had a couple of different over the last 5 to 7 years where I'll have incidents where I have not a migraine, but a very severe short-term headache. So it'll build up and erupt in pain for a few minutes of just like excruciating pain. And it'll only last a couple minutes. But I've had a few of those incidents in the last 5 to 7 years as well. And I actually had one back in August. So the reason that my mom and I had a year to adjust to the idea is right before I left to do my master's degree, I had an appointment with my surgeon, and I wanted to have that appointment because the previous November I had a major incident where I was at work trying to take a customer's order, and it was under a minute. It was probably about 40 seconds. I just couldn't, my brain was working. My brain knew what I wanted to say, but the words were not coming out at all. And I was getting ready to pull my coworker over to take the order because I looked ridiculous standing in front of the customer. It looked like I was like messing with the customer. So I wanted to talk to him about that before I left. And so when I told him about that, he told me to start thinking about surgery. And he also told me not to swim or go camping alone. So I told my mom that, and she had time to adjust. And then she was supposed to talk to my dad, but he didn't want to talk about it.
That's where I got set up, right? Yeah. So, okay. No, that's good. So really it comes down to, the symptoms started to occurring much, much more, and they started to have impacts on your life.
And also just being on this medicine for 12 years, I would like to, a person changes a lot between their late teens and almost 30 years old. So it's like, I kind of want to know what life is like not on these medicines. And all the different ones I've been on, they'll say, no, this isn't a side effect, or this is and this isn't. But then you'll Google your own experience, and people's experiences on these drugs are also varied because they interact so differently. So you'll end up love the epilepsy forum. I end up on there a lot. You'll like be on an epilepsy forum and everyone will be saying like, they say it's not a symptom, but I have this side effect. Me too. And so it's like, yeah, I'd like to know what it's like to not be on them.
Yeah. And although this was probably not the most major consideration for you, it was the symptoms, but you're at a point now where you have a graduate degree and you want to do more with your life, and it may take you potentially to places where the healthcare systems are not that great, and that would have created a risk for you.
Yeah. So for a lot of things, like I might still have migraines after this. We don't know. We won't know for a little bit, but my migraine medication has to be refrigerated, which obviously would not be a feasible option a lot of places. Just access to some of the medications wouldn't be. And then certain jobs, especially things like foreign service or working for the government, I wouldn't have passed a medical exam either because of the drugs or also just having the thing in my brain. So because of things like that, it will open up more potential opportunities to me if I want to pursue those things.
Yep. Well, that's good to hear. So we're going to get a little bit into your connection with the United Kingdom because you went to school over there, and just talk a little bit about the differences in the system, why you had surgery here. But let's just talk about the surgery. So you got home in late 23 after your graduate degree. You're going to end up going back to the United Kingdom on I call it a postgraduate visa, a graduate visa. Yep. Yep. And so, but you decided after you got your degree to have the surgery. We went to the doctor in early January
2nd.
And you had surgery on February 22nd. Can you just walk us through the prep for that and what happened, and actually tell us about the hospital stay, because I was there too and I want to reflect on it too.
Yeah. I had the initial appointment that you were at where we decided to do it for sure, have the surgery. And then I had one pre-op appointment after that just to do all the blood tests and basically make sure I was healthy enough for anesthesia. And then the surgery on the 22nd of February, which was comically ridiculously easy for me. I mean, I know that's not going to be the case for everyone, but for me, it was silly how easy it was. We went in, did the initial stuff we had to do. I remember them pushing, what is it, the propofol?
Yeah.
And I remember nothing else until I woke up.
Yep. I mean, I was absolutely amazed. I was panicked because I thought you were going to be in the hospital for 3 to 5 days. You were out within 30 hours, and I guess young people rebound much more quickly than an old guy like I would. But I expected 3 to 5 days. I expected huge pain. I expected you to be cognitively impacted for at least a period of time. I think the good news was the malformation was fairly superficial, which probably helped in the recovery more quickly.
Definitely.
What was the name of that book that you were literally reading within a couple of hours after getting to the room after recovery?
It wasn't a couple hours. It was the next morning. But it was
enough.
Principles of Conflict Economics.
Principles of Conflict Economics, folks. That's my daughter. So, but anyway, that book, as I understand it, is just sort of the economics of war and things like that, correct?
Yeah.
And that's one of your specialties, right? You have sort of foreign affairs degrees, you speak Arabic and Persian, and you sort of like to research those kind of issues.
I do, yes.
Yeah. But what was the name of that book again?
Principles of Conflict Economics.
Okay. Just wanted to get it on the record one more time.
I got it from you.
Yes, probably right. So, and again, what I was absolutely amazed by was the reason I got, comfortable is we had a second opinion from a very renowned physician in New York City who said, yes, it's the right thing. You had probably one of the top neurosurgeons in the country to do it. You were at a neurosurgery center that is among the top in the country in the Tampa area. And I was just amazed at, you always hear about hospitals being inefficient, having problems and all sorts of delays and wanting to keep you for days and days and days.
We've had some of those experiences.
Yep, we've had some of those even at the same hospital, actually. But in this case, you literally went in, you had the surgery. I remember the doctor coming to the waiting room. They told us to expect maybe 4 or 5 hours, and my wife and I are sitting in the waiting room, and we see him walk in after 2 hours. I thought something had gone wrong, but he had completed the surgery, and they were actually, other physicians were closing her head up and things like that. But literally within, say, 5 hours, you were out of recovery, you were in your room, you spent the night, and by mid-afternoon, we were leaving and we were home. It was amazing. The pain was fairly minimal again, if at all.
I had no real pain. The pain I had was, I think, all from positioning in the surgery. Like, I had a spot in the back of my head that hurt. My neck was sore. That's when they offered me Tylenol. That's why I was taking it, was for my neck. And then, I was from intubation, probably my jaw was sore on one side. And then, my biggest, deficit was my mouth. The right side of my mouth was numb.
Yeah. And that's really the only side effect that you've had from the surgery, right? Just some numbness in your right side, correct?
Yeah. So I still don't have full sensation, I would say, on any part of the right side of my body, but it's so much better from how it was. I think it will continue to improve, particularly my mouth. But if it weren't to improve at all, I'm fine with how it is.
Because it's a lot better than the symptoms.
Yeah. And it's not nearly as bad as it was the first day after the hospital.
Yep.
I can speak completely clearly without having to focus on it. I don't need to drink through a straw and worry about drooling.
Yep. Drooling was very important.
Yes, I did have that issue for a couple days.
Yep. And I hear you have a brand new nickname from your family. What's your nickname?
Yes, you have taken to calling me Data now.
Me? I can't imagine I would do that to you.
No, because you're not a nerd.
Yes. Well, we're big Star Trek fans, and as everybody knows, in the next generation, Data is an android, and we call her Data because you now have a what kind of thing in your head?
I've got 3 little
titanium. Yeah, 3 little titanium plates in her head that will be permanent. So her new nickname is Data. So, and we actually have named every family member after one of the Star Trek Next Generation series characters for everybody. We won't go through all that now, but Kathleen is now Data. So, but anyway, again, it was just amazing to me that you were out so quickly, and it was sort of a multidisciplinary team. It was a neurosurgery, critical care, intensive care unit. We had a hospitalist doing general things, neurologist seeing you, neurosurgeon following up with you. We had occupational therapy, physical therapy, all within that 30-hour period, getting you out with a checklist saying, we want to get this very young person home.
It was the most efficient discharge process I've ever experienced.
Yeah, absolutely amazing.
I didn't think I was going to get out that early, but
yep.
Yeah, it was very impressive.
And if we had known this, again, we probably would have done it a lot sooner. But what was really interesting about the surgery is the technology advances were amazing. Tell us about what you know about this GPS-directed brain surgery.
My understanding, which might not be fully correct, but my understanding is it was MRI guided. So I believe I was partially in an MRI cage. And we know I was pinned. But yeah, so I think the entire surgery was partially guided through MRI to make sure that they got all of the perimeter that they wanted to get, and to make sure that they were where they wanted to be. And so right before the surgery, I had the GPS guided MRI, and then I was during the surgery in an MRI.
Yeah. And as I understand it, the malformation was taken out. Mm-hmm. They also cleared out some of the other bleeding and leftover blood that can lead to seizures.
Yeah, the iron left behind after the blood reabsorbs.
And there's obviously some bleeding that occurred with the surgery, but it's a lot less than what was in there.
Yeah, what he said to me was that normally after a brain surgery, you would be at a higher risk of seizure just because they've been in your brain. But my seizure risk is now lower than what it had been.
And you'll be on seizure meds for maybe another couple of months, and then hopefully they can wean you off it, and you'll really not be at significant or any risk at all for seizures in the future.
That's the hope.
Yeah. And then when it comes to your migraines, which are in the family, the doctor sort of said, well, you still might get migraines because it's in the family, but there was a decent chance that some of them might have been related to the malformation too.
Yeah, he did imply that because they do very much run in our family, that might still be an issue for me. But he did also say that, and this is something that he's asked me, I've been seeing him since I got aged out of the children's hospital. So it's been 5 or 6 years probably. And every time I see him, he always asks again, like, you only ever get them on the one side? They're only ever on the left side? And I'm like, yes, I have never had head pain without like having been hit in the head or something on the other side of my head.
Yeah.
Even when I was a kid, all through like only ever on the left, and they've never changed. They never move. So he basically said that normally doctors are supposed to start looking for issues if that's the case, if you only ever get like one-sided headaches. So hopefully that'd be great. I would love it.
And so because of the brain surgery, you could be off seizure meds, and you could be off even headache medication of any consequence, maybe. Hopefully.
My hope is that even if I do still get migraines, they'll be lessened enough that I can manage them just with a rescue, as they call them, rescue med.
And that would mean that you wouldn't have to have refrigeration and stuff like that. Because I remember, you going to the UK, and we'll talk a little more about this after the break, but we'd have to load you up with medication from the US, cold packs, get you that medication over there. And we'll talk about why that was important too. But it would be great to not have to worry about that if you're traveling. Even when you lived in Egypt and Tajikistan, you weren't on those then, but it would be hard for you to be on those meds and go there.
Yeah, Tajikistan in particular. Yeah.
Yep. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break. We'll take our first break. We will come back and talk about the insurance journey that my daughter has been on and some lessons learned for America.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Marc Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Marc's insights. Twice a week, Marc publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Marc hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Marc's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back, and we are doing our podcast called My Courageous Daughter is Having Brain Surgery, and my special guest is my daughter, Kathleen Ryan, also known as Kitty and also known as Data now. So what I'd like to do here is talk a little bit. We sort of talked about the diagnosis and your years of symptoms and the surgery, and you've come out well, and it's amazing how well you're doing in recovery. You'll probably go back to the UK, I'm thinking in early May now, if you get cleared. But otherwise, there's really nothing wrong with you other than what was wrong with you before in general.
Yes, my usual.
So anyway, we tend to joke a lot and pick on people in my family. But anyway, so let's talk about your insurance journey, because I think this is pretty important. So number one, you were in college and obviously on my insurance. For a while, you were on my employer insurance, but I've been so great that I have this retiree health insurance benefit that I can take advantage of. And you moved over to that with me because you were under 26. And luckily, my retiree insurance, which is platinum easily, it's gold plated, right? And it's a great public service pension plan and health benefit. And so you moved over, you were on my employer, and then you were on my retiree coverage. And my retiree coverage allowed you to stay on my insurance through the end of the year that you turn 26. Not everybody has that benefit. In most places under the federal law, you only are allowed to stay on until the end of the month that you turn age 26. But you literally got an extra 8 months or so, sort of where your birthday ends, roughly 7 or 8 months. But then on 1/1 of 22, effectively you lost insurance. And since you had gone over to undergraduate, you were working, you wanted to stay there, but because of Brexit and COVID and stuff like that, you sort of had to return. You had this dream of going back for graduate school. We'll talk about that. But in the interim, you were working at several jobs where insurance just was not provided, correct?
Yes. I was working at a coffee shop, so I didn't get, obviously, insurance from that. It was a small business, so.
Yep. And the great news about Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act is, given sort of changes in employment patterns and things like that with people under 30 today, many people do work at jobs where they don't have eligibility for health insurance. Right back when I was young, getting into the workforce, you went into and you sort of always had your job and you always had your health insurance, but things have sort of changed with the erosion of health benefits and things like that. So you had to rely on my age 26, so to speak, provision, which was great. And I actually think that's an amazing thing that Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act does, because otherwise our uninsured rate among people under 30 would be so much greater, I believe, this day and age.
Particularly with how jobs work now.
Yep.
You're not necessarily coming out of college with that type of job. You might have to do an internship. You might have to do.
Exactly right. Yep. And you might be in several jobs before you finally figure out exactly where you're going to be. And so, again, I'm a Republican, but I applaud the Affordable Care Act in so many ways. And I think my party actually thinks about the Affordable Care Act all wrong. And we'll talk a little more about that. But then when January 1, 2022 came about, you were essentially uninsured. We had to figure out how to cover you because you aged out of even the Obamacare provision. Your employer did not offer coverage. So we had to put you on Obamacare, which again, you can criticize maybe sometimes the coverage, but it's a program that subsidizes people based on income. So when we signed you up, we sort of could get a subsidy for you. You were at sort of the high end of the range, the higher range of subsidies. So you were eligible for a $200 subsidy. And we had the decision of either putting you on silver, which would have cost you another $300 beyond the $200 subsidy, or put you on a platinum plan, which was $500 in addition to the $200 subsidy. And the reason we're saying this, again, not to criticize Obamacare because it offers coverage and that's important, but we also know that part of the problem in America is being underinsured. And so even Obamacare creates underinsured issues, even though people are getting access. And we actually made the decision to put you on platinum coverage because if we hadn't, the copays on many of your drugs, especially Amivig, would actually have exceeded the cost of the insurance. Yeah. So it was cheaper to pay $500 and get a $200 subsidy and pay very little for your drugs as opposed to paying $300 plus a $200 subsidy and all the copays on your drugs. But what I think is interesting about that decision is that most people could not make that decision, right?
Well, no, and if it weren't for you, I couldn't have either. I would have just gone off the medicines.
Right. You would have gone off the medicines and you probably might have been uninsured.
Yes. And it would have severely lowered my quality of life and probably my ability to work as well, which is why it's a funny, it's a funny predicament, because it's like if you just covered things for people, many people would be able to work. But if you don't cover them, they're going to have poor quality of life and likely not be able to work either.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. It's not just about what I think is the long-term savings of having health insurance coverage, but I think productivity goes down when somebody isn't employed. It isn't covered because they're unemployed. They can work less hours. They're unhealthy, things like that, especially for people that have disease states, right? Like you, you had a disease state that impacted things. And if you weren't on those medications, and, I know that Amavig is, I think, a $700 or $800 monthly medication if you're uninsured. If you were to do that, you might be able to get it for cheaper with certain things, but it's a $700 or $800 medication. Who could afford that? And even on insurance, the copay was so big.
The people who could afford it could already afford insurance.
Exactly.
That's the funny thing.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. And so I have a whole lot of opinions on drug pricing and things like that. But it was weird that we made that decision to put you on platinum. We had the luxury of doing that. But as you point out, people probably couldn't afford the $300 in silver.
No.
And they just couldn't afford the copays for the drugs.
No.
And so as good as I believe the Affordable Care Act is, sometimes it's not exactly right because it creates underinsurance. I think some of the lower income people actually are subsidized for cost sharing, and they're almost better off than the so-called middle income people that have to go to the exchange because they're not getting a big subsidy, if anything at all, and they have to enroll in plans that have high copays, have high deductibles, and things like that. So I think that was a lesson learned for us that there's a lot more work we could do in the United States, even as good as I think Obamacare is for the nation.
And you probably don't want to get into it because I know you've talked about it before on blogs, but the issue of it being very dependent on what state you live in.
Well, let's get there because that's my next place.
That's right.
Yeah, which really bothers me, right? Yes. So when you went to 2023, you went into grad school, right?
Well, end of 22.
End of 22, but you were covered, right? Yeah. And so this is what we found, which was just baffling to me, that my daughter would be part of the so-called coverage gap. And the coverage gap is created in the 10 states in the country, Florida being among them, that has decided not to expand Medicaid. And under the Affordable Care Act, what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to expand Medicaid to about 133% of poverty. And then from 133% and above, people go on the subsidized exchange. Under the national law, though, you can go on the exchange and get a pretty generous subsidy, even at 100% of poverty. But in these 10 states, the Medicaid limits, because they haven't expanded, are down so low, people aren't eligible. Your income has to be literally well below 50%, or you have to be on a sort of a public assistance program. And so this coverage gap creates a no man's land for millions of people in these 10 states. They're below 100% of poverty, but they're too wealthy for Medicaid, and yet they're too poor to get a subsidy because they're not at 100%. Now, the reason you weren't having income in 2023 was a good reason. You were going to graduate school, right? And we wanted to keep coverage for you. But when you were working, you were over 100% and you were qualifying for a subsidy. But somehow in Florida, one of the 10 states that has an expanded coverage, you became part of that coverage gap. And I've been writing about the coverage gap for years and how unfair and inequitable it is. And all of a sudden, my daughter fell into the coverage gap. So what did that mean for us? Well, we wanted to keep your platinum plan because of the drug issue. And we always thought that what if she had to have brain surgery? We wanted a really good plan. So that actually boosted our costs from that $500 on platinum with the subsidy to no subsidy, and we went basically up to $700.
While I had no income.
While you had no income. So again, what's a person to do,
My
right?
costs went up.
Yeah. And by the way, in 2024, there was a big inflation in that platinum plan. So now we're actually paying $775 a month.
Which is crazy.
With no subsidy, right?
Yeah.
Because you came home, you don't have a job yet. You're going to go back over to the UK, but you're still below 100% of poverty. So I just find it honestly outrageous that these 10 states have not expanded Medicaid.
Yeah, and so do I. And I know, because I worked with them and I'm friends with them, I know so many people who don't have the benefits of the family life that I have, who work 40 to 50 hours a week and just don't. They have health issues and they have health needs, but they don't go to the doctors because they can't afford it.
Yep. And
they get no preventative care and all those other things that might make their health worse as a result. And it's just crazy.
Yeah. And one of the beauties about Obamacare is there are zero cost preventative services to spot cancers, to do mammograms, to do those kind of things, which are so important in life. And again, we're back to this point where we're talking about a young generation, even an older generation, that just don't have coverage. Some people are eligible for subsidies or for Medicaid, and for whatever reason, they don't enroll, which I think is tragic. Part of it is health education and health literacy, but some people just don't enroll. But there's a whole mass of other people that aren't eligible for subsidies, that are trapped in this coverage gap, and they literally do not have real coverage. And they're exactly what you're saying, making decisions to not seek out care. And over time, it really catches up with them. So we are so privileged in general to be a family that has never had to worry about healthcare, right? We've had strong health insurance. Sure, in some points of our life, we paid out, $800 a month in coverage, but ultimately we could afford it. We skimped in some years, but we could afford it. We had strong coverage. And unfortunately, not everybody has that ability. I always talk about this statistic. While in some years it may be lower, I think of our country as having about 30 million people that are uninsured in general. It dropped to maybe about 25, 26, but that was because of some weird things happening during COVID and lifting Medicaid restrictions a bit. But think about 30 million people being uninsured in round numbers, which is about 10% of the country. But there are about another 55 million in the country that are what we think of as chronically underinsured. So 30 plus 55, about 85 million people, about 25% of our population fall into this uninsured or underinsured category, which to me is quite tragic. And I believe that if we covered everybody, it might cost us a little immediately, but over time, it could actually bend the cost curve and people could be so much better off. Let's talk a little bit about the UK, right? So tell us about your undergraduate and your graduate, and we're going to go a little into comparing and contrasting the two systems.
So I've always been registered with a GP in the UK at all the.
So tell us a little bit first that you were undergraduate from what years and then graduate?
So I was an undergraduate from 2014 to 2018 in Edinburgh, and then I did my master's from 2022 to 2023 in Glasgow. So I've been in Scotland the whole time, which is a slightly they run their own system separate from the rest of the UK. But it's the same premise of a universal. It's actually a more generous system. You have free prescriptions and everything.
Yeah. In Scotland versus even in the British or the English portion.
It might be too generous in some areas.
It's a good point. Yeah. And so I call that a socialized medicine form. Mm-hmm. And for our listeners, as we talk about, there's sort of three forms of healthcare in the developed world. Socialized medicine, the United Kingdom is a good example of that. Single payer, which is a state-run system, but private services largely. France and Canada are good examples of that. And then there's also private universal access, Germany, Netherlands. But all three of those systems guarantee coverage under national laws, whereas the United States still doesn't really do that, even with Obamacare. So you were in undergraduate for 4 years, 14 to 18, and then 22, 23 graduate. Did you have full access to the United Kingdom system?
I did. So I always had, like I said, I always had a GP, which if I had any needs, I could go. And then I had, in my final year, I had what was probably a seizure or something related to my malformation. So I had made an appointment with my GP, and she, because it is the NHS system, they had to do a blood test first because she thought we need to make sure there's no mineral imbalances or whatever. So they did that, and then that came back normal. So she then referred me on to a neurologist. And because I had this pre-existing condition, I think I got bumped up. I didn't have to wait on a waiting list. I got bumped up. So then I was referred to a neurologist. So I've seen a neurologist within the NHS system 3 times now, because I saw that neurologist twice. And then the second time I've been in the UK for my master's, I've seen a neurologist as well.
So in general, that UK system, theoretically, we'll say, gives you access to all services. In Scotland anyway, it's pretty much zero cost sharing. Is that fair?
I've never paid a dime. Other than with your visa, you pay an NHS surcharge.
That's right.
So which just like people would pay for taxes. So outside of the NHS surcharge, I've never paid a single penny. It's weird. You leave and you're like, you feel like you should be giving something.
And that surcharge annually was less than $1,000 a year, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's cheaper than my insurance here.
Yeah, in 1 month.
Far and away.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. So that's great. So you get universal access there because you're a student. You qualify almost as if you're a citizen. If you pay that surcharge, you had access to drug benefits, primary care specialists, and theoretically, if something happened to you, you would also have hospital coverage.
Oh, yeah. If I were in a car wreck, they're going to treat me. No issue.
Let's, though, talk about maybe some of the downsides, because we're not trashing the UK system, because I would never do that. But what's very interesting is we're going to get back to your surgery, but let's talk a little bit about, where did you see gaps, for example, when you were over there?
Well, we got a really good example of one actually today. I had a preset appointment with a neurologist that was supposed to be on the 16th of this month that I had to reschedule because obviously I'm not going to be there. And so I emailed their appointments email saying that, and they sent me an email back today saying that the earliest appointment available to see the neurologist will be December 17th of this year. So that's just how long the wait lists are. Obviously within that, if you had a severe issue going on, or they thought maybe you had a brain tumor or something, they are going to bump you up. You're not going to be dying slowly waiting on this wait list if you have a major issue, but there are crazy wait lists. It is an overburdened system.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of press right now on that. Again, I give them credit because they give universal access to people, and people of low income and other means don't have to worry about it. But we do see sort of a global budget in the UK, which creates, I would say, underinvestment, sometimes in technology, and also underinvestment in some of that specialty care. So in one case, you were bumped up because you had an issue, but I still think you waited for an MRI for several months, right?
Well, there was an issue where theoretically I was supposed to get that MRI way sooner, but they had my address written down wrong. And this is a technology issue because for some reason they still send out paper letter mail to tell you your appointment. And it went to an apartment below me in my building where no one lived.
Got it.
And there's reasons why that happened. But so I didn't know about it. And I went to my doctor's office to say, hey, you said you were going to refer me and no one's called me. And they said, oh, well, your appointment with the neurologist is tomorrow, but you missed your MRI. And I said, what MRI? So I saw the neurologist and then they did schedule me. That would have been about February. And they did end up scheduling me for another MRI, but I had to wait until June.
Yep.
And then I had to wait to get those results until September because they had a shortage of radiologists.
Yep. And so basically some paperwork, but there was sort of some gap with neurology and the MRI. You talked about right now, when you go back, you won't see a neurologist in the UK until December, which is a little crazy. And then when you tried to get Amavig, because theoretically it's now on the formulary, how long did you wait for that neurology appointment?
So in November of 2022, when I pretty much first got there, I started trying to set that up. And I couldn't get in to see a neurologist until the following August.
Yep.
So August of 23.
Yep.
So nearly a year.
And it took you over a year to actually get cleared to get your Amavig through the United Kingdom.
Yes, because I had to see the neurologist first.
Yep.
And once I saw the neurologist, they said, you're already on it and approved me for it. No problem.
Yeah. But it's sort of that, again, the under budgeting, specialty visits are a problem. And, again, we even hear some things, and I talked about King Charles having cancer in some articles over there that basically also talked about diagnosing cancer because of shortage specialists can also be an issue, and actually undergoing treatment and the delays with that can also be an issue. So again, to put it in context, again, we're not trashing the UK system. They offer affordable access, but there are certainly gaps and issues that they face over there.
Well, and what I would say is everyone I know, which is people around my age, they all will tell you, yes, the system has many, many flaws, and they will complain about it. And I know people who have had to go private because of wait lists, but they will also say they're so grateful for it because they know that they can get eventually healthcare with no cost.
Yep. Makes sense. That's the whole concept of affordable universal access. Let's talk about in the UK system, if you were just a UK citizen and not having access to both systems, what would have happened with your brain surgery? Remember, to refresh the listeners, you came in, initial appointment January 2nd, surgery February 22, about 7 weeks. What do you think would have happened in the UK?
I tend to think in my case, because it wasn't urgent, it wasn't like actively, uncontrollably bleeding, anything like that, they would have kept switching me from various dosages and type of epilepsy medication for a very long time. I suspect there would have been just a lot of that, possibly years of that. And then if I was continuing to have issues, maybe then there would have been a talk about surgery, but it would have been much, much longer.
Yeah. So because of those shortages and the prioritization of people with conditions, you probably would have been years, and only then maybe would you have gotten your surgery. So let's now talk a little bit about bills, because I wanted to go through this. What we've done in the blog as well is we talked a little bit about my daughter having great insurance, a person who might have been underinsured. They have insurance, but high deductibles, high cost sharing, and then ultimately an uninsured person. If they went through what Kitty went through, what would they have paid? Now, we don't have final bills yet, but at the time we wrote a blog that basically said that we believed that the estimates given to us based on what we thought would be the allowed amounts based on some studies, that your entire episode of care was probably going to be right around a billed amount from all these different providers of about $250,000, about $250,000, literally. And we estimated that we felt that ultimately your cost was probably going to be somewhere around $170,000 in terms of what the insurance company would pay, not your cost.
Yeah.
But the cost to cover you, and the payment would have been $170,000. And at the time, we actually estimated that you were going to pay well below $1,000 because your coverage was so great, right? And that was probably a great deal. Admittedly, we've been paying these hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month for great coverage. But so far, and again, bills lag tremendously, but so far, we see billed amounts or provider billed amounts of about $170,000 for the surgery. And believe it or not, the allowed amounts that were paid are only about $44,000. So we were a little bit off in what we think the estimated amounts paid were going to be. The surgeon's bill and things like that are still outstanding, so that $44,000 paid will go up. But one of the reasons we think the estimated amounts that we were given by the hospital and what was ultimately paid is so much less is because you were literally only in for one day. Mm-hmm. And so that ICU care, critical care was only one day and not several days. So far, again, $170,000 billed amount and $44,000 paid by your insurance company, and you have only paid $670. And I don't think you're going to get billed for more than that based on what I see on your coverage.
I mean, I couldn't say for sure, but yeah, it couldn't be much more.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting about this, and again, let's get back to the underinsured and uninsured, is based on, let's take the $170,000 billed amount. We estimate that an uninsured person would be billed for that $170,000. And if you were poorly insured, say you had a bronze or a silver exchange plan and you weren't subsidized, that you might actually pay $10,000 where you paid just $670. Can you sort of react to those numbers, especially that uninsured number of $170,000?
Well, it's just crazy because obviously we know that's not how much it actually costs. Like if it actually costs that much, insurance would be paying that much, and we know they don't. So we know that really it would still be absurd, but they should be paying maybe $40,000 instead of $170,000. So I just don't understand why we're playing this game still of letting hospitals just charge obscene amounts for things when it doesn't actually cost that much. You don't, in no other business do you do that. Yeah. And I would argue hospitals and medical care, yes, in this country, they are businesses, but they're also crucial to people's lives. So it's like, of all the businesses that should be doing it, they're the last.
I think that's incredibly well said. And I feel bad for that uninsured person. Again, that could have been you, right?
Oh, easily. Oh, yeah. So I wouldn't be paying it. I'd be going to collections, or I'd be on a payment plan for the rest of my life.
Exactly. And to me, getting back to that whole issue, again, in the UK, you have universal access, and I admit there's some rationing in essence.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And that could improve even in developed world countries. But here, I think what we've concluded here on the podcast is that, the well-insured have it great, mm-hmm. the wealthy have it great, but, those that are underinsured and uninsured are really sort of at a huge disadvantage. And when we get back, we'll conclude the podcast just on explaining a little bit about what we mean and some final notes there.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Marc Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Marc dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage in a private delivery model. Marc is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Marc's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back. And we're going to conclude the podcast here with our special appearance of my daughter, Kathleen Ryan Kitty, or as we call her now, Data. So when we just took the break, we said we were going to come back and just reflect a little bit on sort of the differences between the well-insured in America and the wealthy who may not have insurance but can just pay out of pocket because it doesn't matter. as well as sort of the people that are underinsured and uninsured. I wanted to ask Kathleen one last question of you. Based on what we know about the UK system, what do you think they need to do to make their universal access system better?
In my very strong opinion as a healthcare expert, I think it's things they already know and just haven't done. But I think there's a lot of administrative bloat, probably. There's just a lot of timeline and people that probably don't need to be there or could be faster so that actual doctors can do their jobs. And then I think that technology is a big thing. Like every healthcare professional in the US has like a healthcare portal where you can log on, you can easily cancel or reschedule appointments. I was very impressed when I realized I could email to reschedule my appointment. That to me was like an improvement on the UK system because previously you had to like call. Like that was the only option. And again, the sending by letter, that's great for older people who probably don't fully understand technology, but for an increasingly younger population using the service, have an online system, have things like that. And it's going to probably cut out some of that administrative issues. Yep. But there's all sorts of other things that I would not be able to speak to just because it's not an area I know. But.
Yeah. So really sort of, you think it's sort of stuck in the old ages in terms of administration.
Probably.
And that they might be able to better invest in technology, both on the treatment side and on just modernizing the system.
Probably, but I think that's probably tough to do because it's one of those things where it's a long-term issue and no one wants to touch it. It's a popular thing that no one wants to get rid of, but it's flawed, and to overhaul it would be a political nightmare. So it's one of those things where it's a political issue.
Sort of like healthcare reform in the United States.
It's the same thing. It's no one wants to touch it, which means nothing's ever going to change.
Yep, makes sense. So you can make a case that the single payer and the socialized medicine system that have their rationing, can get better. They probably will always have some sort of rationing, but they could probably be more efficient and make better investments.
And arguably, though, systems like ours have rationing, too, because either people just don't have access or health insurance companies put in, as they should in some instances, put in things you need to do before you get certain care.
Absolutely right. You're right. The rationing in the national systems like UK or even France and Canada are sort of budgeted, whereas in our system, and we spend a lot more money, as we know, but our system does other forms of rationing. Part of the rationing is, as you say, prior authorization, which is, I think, good rationing. But part of the rationing in our system, which I think is interesting, is we talked about 25% of the nation that is uninsured or underinsured. In essence, that's our rationing. We're not giving people access to that care.
They're just not in the system.
That's right. Whereas when it comes to the folks in other countries, they sort of have this global budget. Now, the truth is when there's a crisis, they do go in the system in the United States, but they're going at the most expensive part, right? Emergency rooms, hospitals. And I would argue over time, if you gave everybody access, it would actually be cheaper than the current system we have.
Access to preventative care. Start treating the conditions before they hit critical mass. It's going to be cheaper.
Exactly right. Yep. And so again, just to conclude here, our view in our series here that my daughter and I sort of collaborated on is, it's a real shame that there are so many people, the 85 million or the 25%, that have either no access or very limited access. I think most of them would like to be healthy and go to the doctor and really make sure they take care of themselves, but they are forced to make decisions in this country that are just, am I going to eat? Am I going to take care of my children? Pay rent? Or am I going to end up going to the doctor and getting my mammogram or getting my colorectal screening? And they're not making those decisions. And unfortunately, if you look at our quality results, they are so much worse. So again, we're privileged to have been insured as a family. our whole lives, to have strong insurance and to never have to worry about that. It doesn't mean that we may not be sick. Mm-hmm. As we know, Kathleen had the brain surgery, and we've even had cancer in our family, but we know that we could always get prevention. And when we found something, we could get it taken care of
quickly.
Yep. And so many other people in this country are just living without that kind of access, and the anxiety around it, to me, is really fairly compelling and something that we have a moral obligation to really try and take care of. Mm-hmm. So anyway, thank you, Kathleen, for doing this. And again, we're concluding our podcast titled, My Courageous Daughter is Having Brain Surgery. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next time on the Healthcare Labyrinth.
Thanks for joining Mark and the Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast.